On February 14, 1943, at exactly 2:14 a.m., the North Atlantic was not merely a body of water. It was a hungry, churning void of liquid ice and absolute darkness. At 52 degrees north and 35 degrees west, the temperature of the air had plummeted to 10 degrees below zero. But the wind chill, driven by a screaming gale, made it feel like 30 below. In this frozen hell, the USS Keppler, a Buckley-class destroyer escort with the hull number DE-15, was laboring through 30-foot swells. The ship was only 300 feet long and barely 2,000 tons, a tin can in every sense of the word. Its hull was composed of steel plates no thicker than a man's finger, and as the freezing spray from the cresting waves hit the deck, it didn't run off. It froze instantly, coating the ship in a layer of icecrete, a mixture of salt, slush, and frozen spray that was rapidly becoming harder than bone. On the bridge, Lieutenant Commander Silas Vance stood with his legs braced against the violent pitch of the ship. At 34 years old, Vance was not your typical naval officer. Before the war, he had been a senior industrial engineer for a locomotive manufacturer in Pennsylvania. A man who spent his days optimizing the thermal efficiency of steam boilers and the structural integrity of heavy iron. He didn't think in terms of naval tradition or maritime glory. He thought in terms of vectors, pressures, and the physical properties of materials. To him, the USS Keppler was not a symbol of American might. It was a complex thermodynamic system currently being pushed to its absolute breaking point by a hostile environment. The Keppler was the primary escort for Convoy SC-118, a slow-moving collection of 42 merchant ships carrying the lifeblood of the Allied war effort. High-octane aviation fuel, crates of tank engines, and thousands of tons of wheat. They were currently in the Black Pit, the mid-Atlantic gap, where land-based aircraft could not reach them. In this 300-mile stretch of ocean, the convoy was a buffet, and the German U-boats were the diners. Less than 2 miles away, submerged in the freezing depths where the water remained a constant, merciful 34 degrees, Kapitänleutnant Hans Voss adjusted the periscope of U-492. Voss was a tactical purist, a veteran of 12 patrols who viewed the Atlantic as a chessboard. He was 31, a man of cold precision, who had earned his Knight's Cross by stalking ships with the patience of a glacier. Through the crosshairs of his periscope, he watched the Keppler. To him, the American destroyer escort was a joker mass-produced flimsy vessel, designed by a nation that valued quantity over quality. He saw the way the Keppler was wallowing in the waves, heavily laden with the weight of the ice accumulating on its superstructure. He knew that in these conditions, sonar was plagued by sea clutter, and depth charges were notoriously difficult to deploy. To Voss, the Keppler wasn't a threat. It was a sheepdog that had been blinded and declawed by the weather. He signaled his crew to prepare the forward torpedo tubes. He wasn't just going to sink the convoy. He was going to humiliate the escort first. Back on the Keppler, the situation was shifting from difficult to catastrophic. Silas Vance felt the ship's rhythm change. It wasn't just the waves. The ship was becoming top-heavy. Nearly 60 tons of ice had already accumulated on the masts, the gun tubs, and the lifeboats. If the weight continued to build, the ship's center of gravity would shift so high that a single rogue wave could capsize them in seconds. Vance turned to his executive officer. He didn't order a change in course. He ordered the chipping parties to the deck. Men bundled in heavy sheepskin coats and life vests crawled onto the freezing, slick steel of the main deck, armed with mallets and crowbars. They weren't fighting Germans yet. They were fighting the ocean. Among them was the chief machinist's mate, Greasy Joe Miller, a man who had spent 20 years in the bowels of various ships and smelled perpetually of diesel and peppermint. Miller reached the stern, where the primary depth charge racks were located. These racks held the Mark VI. Depth charges 300-pound cylinders of TNT, designed to crush a U-boat's hull through hydrostatic shock. Miller swung his mallet at the release lever of the portside rack. The sound that echoed back wasn't the metallic clack of a mechanism ready to work. It was a dull, thudding thump, like hitting a block of granite. He wiped the frost from his goggles and looked closer. The entire rack, from the release pins to the hydraulic tracks, was encased in a solid, 4-inch-thick, translucent shell of ice. The freezing spray had turned the ship's primary weapon into a decorative ornament. He tried the K-guns, the mortar designed to hurl depth charges away from the ship's side. They were even worse. The firing pins were fused solid. The Keppler, tasked with defending 42 merchant ships from a wolfpack, was effectively unarmed. At that exact moment, the sonar operator in the darkened ping jockey shack shouted over the intercom. "Bridge, sonar. I have a solid contact, bearing 085, range 3,000 yards. Moving fast, closing the distance. It's a Type 7. Skipper, I'd bet my life on it." Vance felt a cold chill that had nothing to do with the wind. He looked out at the merchant ships, their silhouettes barely visible against the churning white foam of the sea. If the U-boat got past the Keppler, it would be a massacre. The merchantmen were slow, unmaneuverable, and filled with explosives. A single torpedo in a fuel tanker would turn the entire convoy into a funeral pyre. Vance grabbed the radio handset. "Miller, this is the bridge. Prep the racks. We need a pattern of 6, shallow setting. Now." There was a pause, filled with the static of the storm and the roar of the engines. Then Miller's voice came through, sounding hollow and desperate. "Captain, we can't. The racks are frozen solid. The K-guns are seized. We've been hitting them with everything we've got, but the ice is too thick. We're locked out, sir. We can't drop a single charge." The bridge went silent. The only sound was the howling of the wind through the radar mast and the rhythmic ping. Ping, ping of the sonar, marking the approach of the predator. The odds were now 0. A destroyer escort without depth charges in the middle of a U-boat attack was like a soldier entering a bayonet fight with his hands tied behind his back. The manual dictated that Vance should signal the convoy to scatter and call for assistance from the distant outer screen. But Vance knew the physics of the situation. Scattering would only make the merchant ships easier targets for the rest of the wolfpack. Vance looked at the blueprint of the ship etched into his mind. He didn't see a helpless vessel. He saw a collection of energy sources. He looked at the boiler pressures, the engine RPMs, and the massive weight of the ship's equipment. He remembered his time at the locomotive plant, where they had once used high-pressure steam to clear stubborn ice from the iron rails during the Great Blizzard of '36. If you want to see how an industrial engineer's unconventional thinking turned a defenseless tin can into a weapon that defied every rule of naval warfare, please hit that like button. It tells us you want more of these forgotten stories of technical ingenuity under fire. Vance's eyes narrowed as he looked at the sonar display. The U-boat was now at 2,000 yards. It was positioning itself for a down-the-throat shot. Voss, in the U-492, was likely laughing. He could see the Keppler struggling in the waves, see the men on the deck frantically swinging hammers at frozen metal. Voss was so confident that he didn't even bother to dive deep. He stayed at periscope depth, a mere 40 feet below the surface, preparing to fire. Vance turned to his helmsman. "All ahead, flank," he commanded. The helmsman hesitated. "Sir, the manual says we can't exceed 18 knots in these seas. We'll tear the hull apart or lose the mast." "I'm not interested in the manual," Vance snapped, his voice cutting through the wind like a serrated blade. "I'm interested in kinetic energy. Tell the engine room to bypass the safety regulators on the boilers. One want 120% capacity. If those boilers don't scream, we're all dead. As the Keppler began to vibrate with a new, violent intensity, the inciting incident of this legendary engagement began. It wasn't a shot or an explosion. It was the moment Silas Vance decided to stop being a captain and start being an engineer. He looked at the massive 2-ton anchor resting on the bow, and then at the steam lines running beneath the deck. A plan, so insane that it would later be called maritime heresy, began to take shape in his mind. The U-boat thought it was hunting a sheep. It had no idea it was about to be hit by a 2,000-ton hammer. By 2:22 a.m., the interior of the USS Keppler had transformed into a cacophony of groaning steel and screaming turbines. Down in the engine room, chief machinists, Mate Greasy. Joe Miller was standing in a world of shimmering heat that defied the Arctic gale, raging just inches away on the other side of the hull plates. The temperature in the lower engineering spaces had soared to a sweltering 110 degrees. A sickening contrast to the sub-zero spray freezing the decks above. Miller held a heavy pipe wrench in his grease-stained hands, staring at the lead seals on the boiler safety valves. These seals were the line between a functioning ship and a floating bomb. They were designed to rupture if the steam pressure exceeded 450 pounds per square inch, venting the excess energy before the boilers could turn into shrapnel. Vance's order had been clear: bypass them. Miller knew the math as well as anyone. The Buckley-class destroyer escort was rated for 12,000 shaft horsepower, but they were currently asking the old Foster Wheeler boilers to provide nearly 50. Every rivet in the deck plating was beginning to vibrate with a high-pitched, tooth-rattling frequency. To Miller, the engines didn't sound like machinery anymore. They sounded like a living creature being tortured. He looked at his second-class machinist, a 19-year-old kid named Bobby from Nebraska, whose eyes were wide with a terror he couldn't hide. Miller didn't say a word. He simply gripped the wrench and snapped the first seal. The hiss of overpressurized steam escaping from a minor leak sounded like a predatory cat. They were no longer operating a ship. They were riding a controlled explosion. Up on the bridge, the technical reality was even more grim. The icecrete was no longer just a nuisance on the depth charge racks. It had claimed the Keppler's eyes. The SL radar antenna, a rotating mesh dish atop the mast, suddenly jerked, groaned, and came to a dead stop. The freezing rain had built up inside the gear housing, fusing the drive motor. Lieutenant Commander Silas Vance watched the green phosphor glow of the radar screen flicker and go static. They were now blind in a storm. Moving at 24 knots, suicidal speed for a ship carrying 75 tons of top-heavy ice toward, a target they could only hear through the intermittent pings of a struggling sonar. Vance gripped the edge of the chart table so hard his knuckles turned white. He felt a profound sense of isolation. In the Naval Academy, they taught you about the Nelson touch, about grand maneuvers, and the honor of the line. They didn't teach you what to do when your ship was a frozen block of useless iron, and your only weapon was a collection of industrial scrap. He looked at the stopwatch hanging around his neck. The U-boat was closing. The sonar operator, his voice cracking, reported the distance. Contact at 1,000 yards. He's turning. Skipper. He's lining up his bow tubes. Vance knew exactly what Kapitänleutnant Voss was doing. Voss wasn't just going to fire. He was going to wait for the Keppler to pass over him, thinking the American was attempting a depth charge run. Once the Keppler was committed to its path, Voss would slip underneath and fire a fatter Federapparat torpedo into the belly of the ship. It was a cold, calculated move. Voss had all the advantages: invisibility, functional weapons, and a stable platform. Vance had a vibrating hull, a blind radar, and a crew of shivering men holding mallets. Bridge to engineering, Vance barked into the voice tube. Miller, I need those steam hoses on deck, now. And I need the welding crews at the bow. We're going to perform a field modification on the primary anchor." There was a stunned silence from the engine room. Miller's voice came back, sounding like he'd just been told to jump overboard. "Captain, the anchor, we're in the middle of a gale. If we unseat that anchor now, the winch could snap and take half the forecastle with it." "Do it, Joe," Vance said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous calm. "We can't drop TNT, so we're going to drop 2 tons of forged steel. We're going to use the ship's momentum as the propellant. If we hit that U-boat at 24 knots with the anchor fluke, we don't need an explosion. We just need to breach the pressure hull. Physics doesn't care about the Geneva Convention or the Naval Manual. Physics only cares about mass and velocity." Vance's mind was racing through the calculations he had performed 1,000 times as an engineer. A Type 7 U-boat's pressure hull was approximately 18 to 22 millimeters of ST-52 steel. It was designed to withstand the uniform crushing force of deep-sea pressure, but it was remarkably vulnerable to a localized high-velocity kinetic strike. If he could drop the Keppler's massive 2-ton anchor directly onto the submarine's spine, the sheer force of the impact multiplied by the ship's forward speed would be equivalent to a direct hit from a 5-inch shell. But to do it, he had to get the Keppler within 50 feet of the U-boat. He had to play a game of chicken with a ghost. As Miller and a team of 4 men scrambled onto the forecastle, the true horror of the North Atlantic hit them. The wind was so strong it threatened to peel the skin off their faces. They were carrying heavy, high-pressure steam hoses scavenged from the laundry and engine rooms. The plan was a desperate gamble. Use the live, superheated steam to blast the ice off the anchor winch and the release pins. The men worked in a haze of white vapor. The steam hit the ice with a violent crackling sound, creating a blinding fog that obscured everything. Miller could feel the Keppler's bow plunging into the waves, the freezing water washing over his waist, threatening to drag him into the black abyss. He lashed himself to the railing with a piece of hemp rope, his hands screaming in pain as the heat of the steam hose fought the sub-zero wind. They were bleeding the ship's lifeblood, its very steam pressure to clear the way for this insane maneuver. Every pound of steam they used for the hoses was a pound of steam not going to the turbines. The Keppler began to slow, the hull's vibration changing from a roar to a labored shudder. Below the surface, Hans Voss was becoming increasingly perplexed. He watched the Keppler through the periscope. The American ship was behaving erratically. It was slowing down, then surging. It was shrouded in a strange cloud of white mist. At the bow, "Are they on fire?" his first officer asked. Voss shook his head. "No, they are desperate. They know they can't hit us with depth charges in this sea. They are probably trying to clear their guns." Voss smiled, a thin, cruel expression. "Let them work. We will wait until they are 500 meters away. Then we dive to 30 meters and let them pass over. They will drop their charges into the empty sea, and we will rise behind them like a wolf behind a blind sheep." Voss's arrogance was his first mistake. He viewed the Keppler as a weapon system that had failed. He didn't realize that under Silas Vance, the Keppler had ceased to be a weapon system and had become a mechanical extension of a man's will. On the forecastle, Miller let out a triumphant roar that was swallowed by the gale. "The pin is clear. The winch is free." But, as he shouted, a massive rogue wave, 40 feet high, rose out of the darkness. It slammed into the Keppler's bow with the force of a falling building. The ship groaned, the steel plates bucking. Miller was thrown against the winch housing, his shoulder dislocating with a sickening pop. The steam hose broke loose, whipping across the deck like a white-hot serpent, spraying superheated water into the freezing air. One of the young sailors, a boy named Higgins, lost his footing. He slid toward the edge of the deck, his fingers clawing at the ice-covered railing. Miller, ignoring the agony in his shoulder, lunged forward. He caught Higgins by the collar of his life vest, just as the boy's legs dangled over the churning Atlantic. For a second, they stayed there, suspended between life and a freezing death, while the ship rolled to a terrifying 45-degree angle. The Keppler hung there, balanced on the edge of capsizing, the weight of the ice on the masts pulling it down, down, down. Inside the bridge, Vance felt the ship fail to right itself. "Come on, you beautiful tin can," he whispered, his hand on the throttle. "Don't quit on me now." He shoved the engines to the absolute limit, the overspeed alarms beginning to wail. The propellers bit into the water, providing the lateral thrust needed to pull the ship back from the brink. The Keppler snapped back upright with a violent jerk that threw everyone to the floor. Miller pulled Higgins back to safety, both men gasping for air that felt like liquid needles in their lungs. They didn't retreat. They crawled back to the anchor. They had no choice. The sonar operator's voice came over the deck speaker, distorted and haunting. "Contact is at 500 yards. He's diving. He's going under us." Vance stood up, wiping blood from a cut on his forehead. This was it, the moment of the turn. He could feel the U-boat beneath the waves, a dark shadow waiting to strike. He didn't feel fear anymore. He felt a cold engineering clarity. He had the mass. He had the velocity. Now he just needed the timing. "Miller," Vance screamed into the radio. "Stand by the release. On my mark, you drop that iron, and you pray to whatever god you believe in, that my math is right." The Keppler charged into the darkness, a wounded, frozen Titan, heading straight for the spot where the U-492 had just vanished beneath the foam. The stage was set for a collision of steel and will that no naval manual had ever envisioned. At 2:28 a.m., the engine room of the USS Keppler had become a chamber of mechanical agony. The pressure gauges for the to boiler were no longer just in the red. The needles were vibrating against the physical stops at 500 pounds per square inch. Below the floorboards, the main propeller shafts were spinning at 300 revolutions per minute, a rate they were never intended to sustain for more than a few minutes of emergency sprint. The heat was so intense that the paint on the bulkheads was beginning to blister and peel in long, sticky ribbons. Greasy Joe Miller, his shoulder crudely popped back into its socket by a fellow machinist, stood by the main throttle. He could feel the Keppler's hull warping. The ship was literally twisting under the torque of its own overdriven engines. Every few seconds, a sound like a gunshot would echo through the compartment, the sound of a rivet shearing off and flying across the room like a bullet. But Miller wasn't looking at the boilers. He was focused on the improvised steam lance he had rigged. He had tapped directly into the high-pressure saturated steam line, bypassing the auxiliary regulators. This wasn't just a hose anymore. It was a thermal cannon. He had connected the outlet to the ship's primary anchor winch, creating a makeshift pneumatic piston. In his mind, he was back in the locomotive shop, imagining the anchor not as a piece of maritime equipment, but as a 2-ton slug in a massive, steam-powered railgun. He signaled to the men on the forecastle through the sound-powered phones. They had minutes, perhaps seconds, before the boilers reached their catastrophic failure point. On the freezing forecastle, the conditions were beyond human endurance. The wind was now sustained at 60 knots, whipping the white vapor from the steam hoses into a blinding shroud. Two sailors, their hands bleeding through their heavy gloves, were using a portable electric arc welder scavenged from the repair shop. They were desperately tack-welding 4-foot sections of heavy steel deck, grating onto the flukes of the primary anchor. It looked like a grotesque, industrial bird. Vance had realized that a standard anchor would tumble and drift as it fell through the water column. To hit a submarine moving at 8 knots, 40 feet below the surface, The projectile needed stability. It needed fins. The arc welder hissed and sputtered, the bright blue light reflecting off the ice-covered hull. Every time the Keppler plunged into a wave, the welding arc would short out, sending showers of sparks into the dark. Hurry. Miller's voice crackled through the headset. The intake valves are starting to pit. I can't hold this pressure forever. The men ignored the freezing spray and the risk of electrocution. They were no longer sailors. They were blacksmiths in the middle of a hurricane. They were creating the steam anchor, a weapon born of desperation and the raw laws of physics. Inside the bridge, Silas Vance was experiencing a strange, detached calm. He was an engineer, watching a simulation reach its climax. He looked at the sonar display. The U-492 was now less than 300 yards away. On the status board, the ship's inclinometer showed the Keppler was rolling 35 degrees with every wave. The ship was dangerously unstable, the 60 tons of ice on the upper decks acting as a lever, trying to flip the vessel into the sea. Vance knew that if he didn't drop the weight soon, the ship would simply tip over and never come back. "Captain," the executive officer whispered, his voice trembling. "If we drop the anchor at this speed, the shock will stop the ship dead. The chain will rip the windlass right out of the deck. We'll lose the bow." Vance didn't look away from the sonar. "The chain isn't the point. XO. We're not anchoring. We're firing. I've ordered Miller to rig a quick release on the bitter end of the chain. We aren't going to hold on to it. We're going to let it fly. It's a 2-ton spear, and the Keppler is the arm throwing it." He felt a sudden, sharp pang of guilt. He was risking 180 lives for a theory. He was pushing a machine to its death to save a convoy of merchantmen who would likely never even know his name. He thought of the men in the engine room, standing next to boilers that were effectively live bombs. He thought of Miller, working with the broken shoulder. This was the burden of command that the textbooks never quite captured the cold math of human sacrifice. Below the waves, Kapitänleutnant Hans Voss was losing his patience. The sound of the Keppler's propellers in the hydrophones was deafening. It was a high-pitched, frantic thrumming that told him the American ship was at maximum speed. "He's coming straight for us," the hydrophone operator reported. "He's not zigzagging, he's charging." Voss stepped away from the periscope. The fool. "He thinks he can ram us. He doesn't realize he's just giving us a perfect profile." Voss checked his depth, 40 feet. He was shallow enough to see the Keppler's keel if he looked up, down periscope. "Dive to 20 meters. Level off and prepare to fire tube 1 as he passes over. He will be looking for us behind him, but we will be right beneath his belly." Voss's decision to dive was his tactical undoing. By descending to 20 meters roughly, 65 feet, he was moving into the exact center of the Keppler's kill zone. He thought he was moving to safety, putting more water between himself and the American's bow. He didn't realize that Vance wasn't trying to hit him with the ship. He was timing the drop of a projectile that would accelerate through the water column, gaining kinetic energy with every foot it fell. The Keppler's sonar pings were now a continuous, shrill scream. Ping, ping, ping. Range, 100 yards. The operator shouted, "Steady on course," Vance commanded. "Miller, stand by the steam release. Forecastle, clear the area. Get behind the gun tub, now." The men on the deck dropped their tools and scrambled for cover, lashing themselves to anything solid. The anchor, now fitted with its crude steel fins, sat perched on the edge of the cathead, held in place by a single ice-encrusted release pin. Miller, in the engine room, gripped the lever for the high-pressure steam bypass. He could feel the heat radiating from the pipes, the smell of burning oil filling his lungs. He was waiting for the signal that would vent all that stored energy into the winch's release mechanism. 50 yards. The Keppler was now riding a massive swell, its bow rising high into the air, the freezing wind howling through the rigging. For a second, the ship seemed to hang suspended in the void, the moonlight breaking through a gap in the clouds to illuminate the frozen deck. 30 yards, he's right under us, skipper. He's right under us. Vance felt the vibration of the U-boat's own engines transmitted through the Keppler's hull. It was a low, rhythmic thrumming, like the heartbeat of a giant. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, calculating the lead, the velocity of the ship, and the rate of descent for 2 tons of iron. In that moment, he wasn't a naval officer. He was a mathematician solving the final variable of his life. Drop it. Vance roared. Miller slammed the lever home. A massive plume of superheated steam erupted from the winch housing, the pressure instantly shattering the ice and shearing the release pin like it was made of glass. The anchor didn't just fall. It was kicked off the deck by the pneumatic force of the steam. The 2-ton iron mass, trailing 50 fathoms of heavy steel chain, vanished into the churning white foam of the Keppler's wake. The ship bucked and shivered as the weight left the bow, the sudden loss of 60 tons of ice and iron causing the vessel to leap forward like a horse released from a tether. On the bridge, the shockwave was physical. A massive thump vibrated through the deck plates, followed by a sound that no one on board had ever heard before. A deep, metallic crunch that echoed up through the water and resonated in the Keppler's hull. It was the sound of something indestructible being broken. Vance grabbed the radio handset, his voice tight. Sonar, report. Did we hit? Give me a reading. The sonar operator was silent for a long, agonizing 5 seconds. Then, his voice came through, filled with a mixture of awe and terror. Skipper, the contact. It just stopped. I have high-frequency braking noises. I have, oh God, I have air bubbles. Lots of them. The U-boat is breaking up. Deep below, the steam anchor had done exactly what Silas Vance's engineering mind had predicted. The fins had kept the fluke vertical, turning the anchor into a kinetic spear. It had struck you for 9-2 directly behind the conning tower, the point of the fluke punching through the outer casing and the pressure hull with the force of a falling locomotive. The anchor didn't just dent the sub. It wedged itself into the spine of the vessel, the heavy chain wrapping around the hull like a tightening noose. The U-boat's internal bulkheads collapsed instantly under the sudden, massive influx of seawater at 6 atmospheres of pressure. Kapitänleutnant Hans Voss didn't even have time to scream. The Atlantic claimed him and his crew in a matter of seconds. The Keppler continued to surge forward, but the victory was far from certain. The boilers were still screaming, the engines were failing, and the ship was now trailing a broken chain into the depths. The tin can had survived the wolf, but now it had to survive its own internal destruction. At 2:31 a.m., the North Atlantic momentarily yielded to a sound that was more terrifying than the storm itself. It was the sound of a submarine's spine snapping a deep, metallic groan that vibrated through the hull of the USS Keppler and into the very marrow of the men on board. The sonar operator, a 20-year-old from Ohio named Petrovsky, sat frozen in his chair, his headphones half ripped from his ears. He had just heard the deaths of 48 German sailors. The high-frequency breaking up noises were unmistakable, the shrieking of air being squeezed out of ballast tanks, the muffled internal explosions of batteries short-circuiting in salt water, and the final, haunting ping of the U-boat's hull imploding as it reached its terminal depth. But for the USS Keppler, the victory was nearly a suicide. Down in the engine room, Greasy Joe Miller was fighting a different kind of war. When Vance had ordered the steam release to fire the anchor, the sudden drop in pressure, followed by the surging rebound of the overtaxed boilers, had created a water hammer effect. A main steam line, 4 inches in diameter and carrying 500 pounds of pressure, had partially ruptured. The compartment was filling with superheated vapor that could peel skin from bone in a heartbeat. "Get out." Miller screamed at the Nebraska kid, Bobby, shoving him toward the ladder. Miller himself stayed. He wrapped a heavy sheepskin coat around his arm and lunged through the blinding white mist to reach the manual bypass wheel. His hands, even through the leather, felt as if they were being pressed into a furnace. With a primal roar, he wrenched the wheel shut, diverting the lethal steam. The Keppler shuddered, its speed dropping from 24 knots to a sluggish 5. The turbines groaned as they wound down, the ship's vibration changing from a frantic scream to a low death-rattle thrum. On the bridge, Silas Vance felt the ship lose its momentum. The Keppler was wallowing now, no longer cutting through the waves, but being pushed by them. He looked back at the wake. In the pale, sickly light of the moon, a massive, iridescent slick of diesel oil began to flatten the whitecaps. Debris wooden crates, pieces of insulation, and a single, lonely life jacket bobbed in the freezing water. U-492 was gone. The steam anchor had found its mark. As the sun began to rise at 7:15 a.m., the storm finally broke. The wind died down to a manageable 20 knots, and the sky turned a bruised, cold purple. The convoy, scattered but intact, began to reform on the horizon. The merchant ships passed the crippled Keppler one by one. There were no cheers, no radio messages of thanks. The merchant crews were too exhausted, too traumatized by the night to celebrate. But on the bridge of a British tanker, a captain raised his hand in a slow, solemn salute as he saw the Keppler's missing bow anchor and the twisted, blackened remains of its winch. The Keppler limped into the port of Londonderry, Northern Ireland, 3 days later. It was a ghost of a ship. Its hull was warped. Its forward deck was a mangled ruin of sheared rivets and scorched steel. And its boilers were so badly pitted they would never hold full pressure again. When the port authorities and the Naval Board of Inquiry stepped on board, they didn't see a hero ship. They saw a mess. 2 weeks later, Lieutenant Commander Silas Vance stood in a sterile, wood-panelled room in London, facing a board of 3 admirals. On the table before them was the Keppler's logbook and a thick file of engineering reports. Commander Vance, the presiding admiral, began, his voice dripping with bureaucratic disdain. "You are charged with the willful destruction of government property, the unauthorized modification of a vessel's primary structural components, and the reckless endangerment of your crew. You bypassed safety regulators that have been standard in the Navy for 40 years. You used a 2-ton anchor as a, what did you call it? A kinetic projectile." Vance stood at attention, his eyes fixed on the far wall. The depth charge racks were frozen. "Admiral, the K-guns were inoperable. I followed the laws of physics when the laws of the Navy failed me." "Physics," the Admiral scoffed. "You turned a destroyer escort into a scrap heap. You lost a primary anchor and 50 fathoms of chain. You warped the main drive shafts. The Keppler will be in dry dock for 6 months. All because of a contact that your sonar operator claims was destroyed by a piece of iron. There is no physical evidence of a kill. No wreckage was recovered. For all we know, you hit a whale and panicked." The board recommended a letter of reprimand and a permanent not fit for promotion mark on Vance's record. They viewed him not as an innovator, but as a civilian in a uniform who didn't respect the equipment. Silas Vance was quietly transferred to a desk job in the Bureau of Ships, where he spent the rest of the war calculating stress loads for cargo hulls. He never commanded a ship again. Greasy Joe Miller was given a medical discharge for the 3rd-degree burns on his hands. He went back to Pennsylvania and never spoke of the night the anchor flew. For decades, the story of the Keppler was nothing more than a sea story told by aging veterans in smoky Baza, legend of the unorthodox. Navy that most historians dismissed as an exaggeration. The official Navy records simply listed U-492 as missing in action. Cause unknown. Then, in 1994, a deep-sea salvage team, conducting a survey for a new fiber-optic cable, found something on the floor of the North Atlantic, 3,000 meters down. It was the wreck of a Type 7 U-boat. But it wasn't a torpedo hit that had sunk it. The ROV's cameras panned over the conning tower and settled on the spine of the submarine. There, wedged deep into the crushed pressure hull, was a massive 2-ton iron anchor. Welded onto its flukes were the unmistakable remnants of steel deck grating crude, improvised fins that had survived 50 years of salt and pressure. The anchor was still there, locked in the submarine's ribs like a spear in the side of a fallen mammoth. The steam anchor wasn't a myth. It was a cold, hard fact of history. Silas Vance died in 1982, 12 years before his vindication. He never knew that his industrial engineering had been proven right. He never knew that he had pulled off the most improbable kill in the history of anti-submarine warfare. This is the reality of war that the history books often miss. It isn't always won by the biggest guns or the most polished protocols. It is won by the men who refuse to accept the limitations of their equipment. It is won by the engineer who looks at a broken machine and sees a new way to fight. It is won by the tin cans and the greasers who hold the line when the manual says they should have already surrendered. If the story of the USS Keppler and the man who used an anchor to sink a Titan moved you, please hit that like button. Every like helps us bring these forgotten stories of human ingenuity out of the shadows and into the light. These men didn't fight for medals or for the approval of a board of inquiry. They fought for the man standing next to them and for the survival of the ships they protected. Drop a comment below and let us know what you think of Vance's maritime heresy. Was he a reckless gambler or a misunderstood genius? We want to hear from you. You are part of this community, and your voice keeps these memories alive. The North Atlantic is still there, cold and indifferent, holding the secrets of 1,000 ships. But somewhere in its depths, the USS Keppler's anchor still holds its prize. A silent monument to the day when a small American destroyer charged into the dark and did the impossible.